In 1924, Thomas Keller arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, carrying only a small suitcase and a leather-bound notebook. He had been sent by his editor to gather stories about the forgotten legends of America's coastal cities, but the assignment quickly became more than work. As his train rolled into the station, he caught his first glimpse of the city's skyline, where church spires rose above the clustered rooftops. A humid breeze carried the mingled scents of salt water and magnolia blossoms, and he felt an immediate heaviness in the air, as if the city itself breathed with secrets.
The streets welcomed him with narrow lanes paved in worn cobblestones. Horses' hooves echoed against the uneven stones, and the sound of carriages mixed with the distant toll of a church bell. The facades of old houses stood tall and silent, draped in ivy that climbed toward their shuttered windows. The port, not far from where he lodged, smelled of fish, tar, and seaweed, a reminder that Charleston's life was tied to the tides. Every corner of the city seemed to carry a history older than the man himself, and he felt both the weight and allure of it pressing against him.
Though Charleston appeared graceful and calm on the surface, Thomas sensed something else lurking beneath its charm. The city's past whispered to him in fragments, stories of pirates who once anchored in its harbor, of ships that carried human cargo across the ocean, of plagues that swept through its streets, and of hurricanes that tore apart its fragile wood and stone. Locals smiled politely when he asked questions, but their eyes betrayed a reluctance to speak of certain places, especially the old houses near the waterfront. It was as if silence itself had become part of Charleston's language, shielding its darker truths from curious outsiders.
Thomas felt an uneasy thrill as he wandered deeper into the city. His profession demanded that he chase stories, but here, he realized that stories might just chase him back. Charleston was not merely a backdrop for his work, it was a living presence, watching and weighing him, waiting to see how far he dared to go. Beneath his eagerness lay a quiet fear, one he could not yet name. And yet, standing among the shaded streets and weathered walls, he knew one thing with certainty. Charleston would not let him leave unchanged.
Thomas spent long hours in Charleston's library, where the dust of centuries seemed to cling to every page he touched. He worked his way through brittle newspapers, yellowed letters, and handwritten journals that bore the ink stains of lives long gone. The stories he uncovered were unsettling. Sailors who had vanished after docking in the harbor, ships swallowed by sudden storms, and whispers of a strange illness that had swept through the neighborhoods near the Cooper River in the mid-19th century. Each account hinted at more than simple misfortune, as though something unseen had chosen that part of the city to make its mark.
Among the most chilling discoveries was the name of the Vanderlei family, once powerful merchants who traded in goods from across the Atlantic. Their fortune had built one of the grandest houses near the waterfront, a mansion that dominated the street with its tall columns and ornate balconies. Yet the record showed a family haunted by tragedy. Each generation told the same tale. The firstborn son would either be claimed by the sea or lose his mind to some creeping madness. The pattern stretched back decades, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence.
The final entries in the archives spoke of the last mistress of the house, a woman whose death was marked only by vague phrases and uncertain testimony. Neighbors had written that she collapsed suddenly one evening, her body found at the foot of the staircase. Others hinted at something more sinister, suggesting she had been driven to despair by sounds that no one else could hear. After her passing, the house stood empty, its windows shuttered, its gardens choked with weeds. Over time, its walls began to crumble, yet its presence remained heavy on the street, as though the building itself refused to die. Local accounts added to the unease. People living nearby swore they heard footsteps echoing through its halls when no one was inside. Children spoke of laughter drifting from broken windows,
the voice light and playful, though the rooms were long abandoned. Some insisted that on certain nights, a bell could be heard ringing faintly at 3 in the morning, its sound cutting through the silence like a warning. These testimonies repeated in different forms across decades, passed down with both fear and fascination. For Thomas, the Vanderlei story seemed perfect for his assignment. It had all the qualities of legend: tragedy, mystery, and a lingering presence that defied time. Yet, as he copied passages into his notebook, he felt a shift within himself. What began as professional research was growing into something deeper. The fragments of the past no longer felt like cold evidence. They pressed against him, demanding his attention. Curiosity hardened into obsession, and though he told himself it was for the sake of his article, he already sensed that Charleston's secrets were binding him to a path he would not easily leave. At sunset, Thomas finally stood before the Vanderlei mansion, its silhouette etched in darkening gold against the horizon. The wrought iron gates leaned heavily on rusted hinges, and the garden beyond was choked with wild grass and tangled vines. Despite its decay, the house retained the trace of former grandeur. Tall columns stretched toward the sky, and the ornate balcony, though crumbling at the edges, suggested a time when the place had been alive with light and voices. Now it loomed in silence, watching him approach with the weight of decades pressing down on its walls. Inside, the air was dense with dust, and the faint scent of sea brine carried from the nearby harbor. There was another note to the smell, sharper and harder to define, like salt mixed with iron, as though the house itself had absorbed the tragedies that once unfolded there. The floorboards groaned beneath his steps, their sound echoing unnaturally in the vast, empty corridors. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls, patterns with anchors, ropes, and gulls, symbols of the sea that seemed almost mocking in their cheerful design against the house's present desolation. In one of the first rooms he entered, the remains of a parlor, Thomas noticed strange marks on the wall. Drawn in charcoal, the symbols were rough yet deliberate, clustered in patterns he could not recognize. They seemed neither random nor decorative, as if they held meaning for someone who had once lived or lingered within those walls. The sight unsettled him, but it also fueled his determination. He copied them into his notebook even as the shadows in the corners deepened. On the wooden floor lay a doll, its dress torn, its porcelain face scarred by deep scratches where the eyes should have been. Thomas bent to pick it up, brushing the dust from its surface, when a sound echoed from above. It was not the creak of settling beams, but something more distinct, the heavy scrape of furniture being moved across the floor. He froze, his breath caught in his chest, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Fear rose within him, sharp and insistent, but it did not drive him away. Instead, it confirmed what he already suspected. This house was alive with the remnants of its past. He placed the doll back on the ground, his hand trembling slightly, and forced himself to continue walking through the rooms. With every step, his heart beat faster, yet curiosity guided him deeper. As he left the mansion that night, the last light of day fading from the windows, Thomas knew he had crossed a threshold. The Vanderlei house was no longer just a subject for an article. It had become a presence that demanded his return, drawing him into its silence, into its shadows, and into the stories it refused to let die. From that evening forward, he found himself compelled to return again and again, pulled further into the gravity of a past not his own. With each return to the mansion, the house revealed itself more openly, as though acknowledging Thomas as part of its silent audience. The air grew heavier, and the walls seemed to carry a restless tension, waiting to unburden their secrets. One night, guided only by a lantern's glow, he noticed fresh handprints smeared across the faded wallpaper. The prints were damp, darker than the surrounding surface, as though pressed there only moments before.
Yet he knew with absolute certainty he was alone. The sight tightened something in his chest, and for the first time, he felt the weight of being watched, not by memory, but by presence. In the library, where dust thickened like a second skin over forgotten shelves, Thomas discovered an old ledger. Its pages were brittle, but between the lines of trade notes and numbers, he found the name of a ship, the Siren. Records tied the vessel to the Vanderlei family, its fortune seemingly built not only on goods, but on people, transported and hidden below deck. The legend whispered through Charleston claimed that the Siren had gone down in a violent storm near the harbor, dragging its crew and unwilling passengers into the depths. The Vanderlei home, so the story said, absorbed the grief and terror of that night, carrying the cries of the drowned within its walls. Soon, Thomas began to hear those cries for himself. At first, they came in dreams, indistinct wails blurred by sleep, echoing like the roar of waves against stone. But gradually, the cries sharpened, turning into voices that seemed to circle him in the darkness of the mansion's halls. They spoke no words he could understand, yet their desperation clung to him long after he awoke. Shadows moved at the edge of his sight, restless shapes that wandered the corridors like prisoners searching for escape. One evening, as he studied the dimly lit parlor, his eyes caught on the tarnished mirror that hung against the wall. For an instant, it did not return his reflection. Instead, he saw the figure of a man clad in a naval uniform from the 19th century. The face was twisted and wrong, waterlogged features marked by pain and fury. The apparition vanished in a blink, leaving only his pale reflection staring back at him. The moment sank deep into his mind, convincing him that the mansion was not merely haunted by rumor, but bound to a history too cruel to rest. Charleston itself began to feel like an extension of that prison. The narrow streets, the heavy air, the watchful windows of old buildings, all seemed to conspire in tightening the circle around him. The house was no longer just a place he visited. It was becoming a center of gravity, pulling him inward with unseen chains. What had begun as an investigation now felt like a descent, and Thomas realized that leaving was no longer as simple as walking away. The city held him, and at its heart, the Vanderlei mansion waited, patient and unrelenting. In the autumn, when storm winds turned the streets of Charleston into a chorus of low howls, Thomas stepped once more into the mansion. The air outside had been sharp with salt and rain, yet within the house there was a strange stillness, as if the storm could not touch the walls that had already endured centuries of unrest. Moonlight spilled through broken windows, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to him that the house was no ruin at all, but restored to its former grandeur. The banister gleamed, the staircase rose firm and polished, and in the upper rooms, faint candlelight flickered as though the household had never left. Drawn upward by an impulse he could not resist, Thomas ascended the staircase. The boards, usually loud with their groans, carried him now in silence. He entered a small chamber that revealed itself as a child's room. The walls bore faded drawings of ships, crude yet vivid outlines of masts and sails stretching across plaster that seemed to breathe with memory. As he stepped further inside, he noticed the imprint of bare feet darkening the floorboards. The prints formed a trail that led toward the shadowed corner, only to vanish where the light failed to reach. A mirror stood along the far wall, its glass dull with age. Thomas approached, bracing himself for the reflection he expected, but what greeted him was something unrecognizable. His figure was there, but distorted beyond familiarity. Where his eyes should have been were hollows of blackness, empty and endless. His face appeared fractured, lined with fissures like cracks in saltstone, as though the sea itself had carved its mark upon him. The image shimmered and wavered, neither solid nor ghostly. And in that moment, he felt the terrifying realization that he was no longer only observing the haunted past, he was becoming part of it. The storm outside rose in strength, rattling the shutters and filling the house with a deep, resonant hum. Yet within those walls, it mingled with another sound, one that came not from the present, but from the echo of centuries. It was the call of the drowned, the whispers of sailors, the weeping of children, the cries that had seeped into the stone and timber of the Vanderlei estate. The voices surrounded him, pressing in from every side, merging with the rhythm of the storm until they became indistinguishable. His breath grew shallow, his body lighter, as though the air itself had begun to lift him away. He clutched his notebook close, but even that anchor felt fragile against the pull of the house. The pages slipped from his hands and scattered onto the floor near the bed. Their inked lines still intact, their stories left behind. For a final instant, he stood in both worlds. The man who had come to investigate a legend and the specter he was becoming. When the wind surged and the candles vanished into darkness, so too did Thomas. The room stood empty, the notebook resting where he had dropped it, silent testimony to his presence. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the mansion, all was still. For Charleston, the Vanderlei house had claimed another soul, and by morning his name would join the whispers of those who had entered its doors and never returned. Charleston continued to live its double life. By day, the streets filled with visitors who admired the pastel facades, strolled through shaded courtyards, and listened to cheerful guides recounting tales of pirates, plantations, and the Civil War. The air carried the scent of magnolias and salt water, and the city seemed timeless in its beauty. But when night fell, the charm shifted. The same narrow streets grew hushed, and the weight of silence pressed into the corners. The city's long memory stirred, and its shadows seemed to extend themselves, watching, waiting, whispering. It was in those hours of quiet that rumors spread. A new story had begun to circle among the people, spoken first in hushed tones and then retold as if it had always belonged to Charleston's collection of haunted truths. They said the Vanderlei house had gained another presence. Some claimed that within its darkened rooms there was the faint clatter of typewriter keys, rhythmic and insistent, as if words were still being recorded by unseen hands. Others swore they had glimpsed a man with a stack of newspaper pages in his grasp, his figure flickering at the end of a corridor before dissolving into the gloom. The whispers grew into certainty, and soon the new legend became inseparable from the old. For the older residents of Charleston, it was nothing unusual. They insisted the city simply absorbed what it was given, weaving every tragedy, every disappearance into its living fabric. To them, the mansion had not changed. It had only collected another ghost, as naturally as the tide reclaimed debris from the shore. The new presence joined the drowned voices of the siren, the echoes of the Vanderlei family, and the countless others who had slipped through Charleston's veil of time. The house itself remained locked in silence, its windows reflecting only the shifting light of moon and storm. Tourists passed it by during the day without more than a glance, but at night some paused at its gates, uneasy though they could not explain why. They left quickly, whispering afterward of how the shadows inside the house seemed thicker than elsewhere, or how the air carried the faint tang of salt and iron. The mansion endured, both ruin and monument, both warning and invitation. For Charleston, Thomas Keller had become part of its eternal story. He had entered the city as a journalist, eager to collect legends and expose their truth, but in the end, he was claimed by them. His notebooks, left behind, became relics, the last physical trace of his investigation, while he himself dissolved into the myth he had sought to untangle. The city did not mourn him, for it had never mourned those who came too close. Instead, it folded him into its memory, an unbroken chain of voices and shadows stretching across centuries. Charleston endured, as it always had, a living organism that thrived on remembrance and silence alike. And in that silence, the figure of Thomas Keller lingered, another story for strangers to discover, another whisper to unsettle the night. The city had proven once more that those who reached too deep into its past were never allowed to leave it.